The most expensive mistake in business is laughing at something you do not understand. Ethan Carter heard the laughter before he even shut off the engine of his old pickup truck. The sound drifted across the sprawling exhibition grounds of the Texas Performance Engineering Summit, a yearly gathering where executives, investors, engineers, and automotive innovators showcased the future of high-performance technology. Luxury sports cars lined the entrance. Corporate banners stretched across massive glass buildings. Everywhere he looked, people wore expensive suits, designer watches, and company credentials hanging from polished lanyards. Ethan stepped out of the truck and looked into the rear cargo area. Resting on a reinforced steel frame sat the object that had consumed nearly 6 years of his life. A hand-built engine. It was not polished. It was not painted to impress investors. It looked more like something built inside a small workshop than inside a billion-dollar research facility. To Ethan, that never mattered. He grabbed his toolbox and carefully secured the transport straps one final time. His phone vibrated. A message from Lily. "Do not let anybody make you nervous today." A small smile appeared on his face. "I will try." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "You always say that before proving everyone wrong." Ethan laughed softly and slipped the phone into his pocket. 20 minutes later he rolled the engine display into the main exhibition hall. Conversations filled the enormous room. Corporate representatives stood beside futuristic prototypes. Engineers demonstrated advanced systems to crowds of investors. Television crews moved between exhibits gathering interviews. Most people barely noticed Ethan. Until they saw what he was bringing. Several heads turned. A few smiles appeared. One investor looked at the exposed engine and whispered something to a colleague. Both laughed. Ethan ignored them and continued moving. At the center of the hall stood Victoria Hayes, Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Performance Technologies. Her company dominated much of the exhibition floor. Reporters surrounded her. Cameras followed her every movement. She represented exactly the kind of success most people dreamed about. Intelligent. Respected. Powerful. Victoria noticed the unusual display being pushed across the floor and glanced toward it. Her eyes moved from the engine to Ethan's worn work jacket. Then to the aging transport cart. A reporter beside her smiled. "Looks like someone brought a science project." Several people nearby laughed. Victoria studied the engine for another moment. "I suppose confidence is free," she said. The comment was not cruel. It was casual. Almost harmless. Yet the surrounding crowd immediately joined in. More laughter followed. Ethan heard every word. He simply kept walking. Victoria noticed his lack of reaction. Most people would have defended themselves. Some would have argued. Ethan did neither. He calmly positioned the engine inside the independent exhibitor section and began unpacking tools. Across the hall, conversations continued. But something unexpected happened. One elderly engineer stopped walking. He stared at the engine longer than everyone else. Then another engineer slowed down. Neither laughed. Neither spoke. They simply looked. Ethan noticed but said nothing. He continued working in silence. Because while most people in the room saw an unfinished machine, Ethan knew something they did not. The real value of an invention is rarely visible during the first glance. And before the day was over, everyone in that building was about to learn just how expensive a first glance could become. For the next hour, most visitors treated Ethan Carter's display exactly the way he expected. They glanced at the engine. They noticed the exposed components, the handcrafted sections, and the absence of corporate branding. Then they moved on. The summit was filled with polished prototypes backed by research teams and marketing departments. Compared to those exhibits, Ethan's display looked almost ordinary. He seemed completely comfortable with that. While investors crowded around luxury presentations and executives delivered speeches about the future of automotive engineering, Ethan quietly continued preparing his demonstration. He checked measurements, tightened a few fittings, reviewed handwritten notes. Nothing about his movements suggested he was trying to impress anyone. Across the exhibition hall, Victoria Hayes continued meeting with investors and media representatives. Yet several times she found herself glancing toward the independent exhibitor section. Not because of Ethan. Because of something else. Two respected engineers had stopped at his display and stayed there far longer than expected. One of them was Harold Whitaker, a retired engineer whose opinions carried enormous weight throughout the industry. Harold rarely showed interest in unknown inventors. Yet there he stood, studying Ethan's engine in complete silence. Another engineer joined him. Then another. None of them laughed. None of them made jokes. They simply observed. Ethan noticed the growing attention but continued working. Eventually Harold leaned closer and pointed toward a section near the engine block. Who designed this geometry? Ethan looked up. I did. Harold frowned slightly. Why? Ethan wiped his hands with a shop cloth. Because the traditional approach created limitations. The older engineer stared at him for several seconds. What limitations? Ethan considered the question. The same ones everyone has been accepting for years. Several nearby engineers exchanged curious looks. The answer sounded simple. Yet something about it unsettled them. Harold studied the engine again. Interesting. He said nothing more. But his expression had changed. Across the room, Victoria noticed. Reporters continued asking her questions, yet her attention drifted toward the small crowd beginning to form around Ethan's display. A few minutes later, another engineer arrived carrying a tablet filled with technical specifications. He compared Ethan's design to existing performance data. His confident expression slowly disappeared. Then he checked the numbers again. Nearby visitors noticed the reaction immediately. Conversations began spreading. Quiet at first. Then louder. Ethan's phone vibrated. Lily. How is it going? Ethan smiled. People are asking questions now. Her answer came instantly. That means they are nervous. Ethan laughed softly. Maybe. Are they? Still laughing? He glanced around the display area. Nobody was laughing anymore. Not really. Another message appeared. Good. Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket and returned his attention to the engine. The crowd continued growing. Engineers whispered among themselves. Some took photographs. Others requested permission to inspect specific areas. Ethan allowed them. He never acted defensive. Never tried to protect the design with dramatic secrecy. That seemed to confuse people even more. Then something unusual happened. One of the engineers stepped back and quietly made a phone call. Moments later another industry specialist arrived. Then another. Victoria noticed the pattern immediately. Experts were not gathering because of curiosity anymore. They were gathering because somebody had found something. She excused herself from a conversation and began walking toward Ethan's display. As she approached, she noticed a detail she had missed earlier. The people studying the engine were no longer smiling. They looked concerned. And for the first time that day, Victoria Hayes found herself wondering whether the most important exhibit at the entire summit might be the one she had dismissed with a joke. Victoria Hayes slowed her pace as she approached the growing crowd surrounding Ethan Carter's display. The reaction alone was unusual. At an event filled with corporate showcases worth millions of dollars, independent exhibits rarely attracted this level of attention. Yet nearly every person gathered around Ethan's engine carried the same expression. curiosity mixed with concern. Victoria stopped beside Harold Whittaker and studied the engine again. At first glance, it looked exactly the way she remembered. Functional. Unpolished. Almost ordinary. "What am I missing?" she asked quietly. Harold did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the engine. "That is exactly the question," he finally said. Victoria frowned slightly. Around them, several engineers continued examining measurements and specifications displayed on tablets. One of them shook his head and checked the numbers again. Then a third time. Ethan stood nearby, calmly organizing tools inside his toolbox. He did not appear interested in the growing attention. That seemed impossible. Most inventors would be eager to explain their work. Ethan seemed content to let people reach their own conclusions. Victoria stepped closer. "Mr. Carter." Ethan looked up. "Ms. Hayes." Several respected engineers suddenly seem very interested in your project. Ethan nodded. "Looks that way. Would you care to explain why?" Ethan glanced toward the engine. "Not yet." The answer caught her off guard. Not because it was rude. Because it was confident. Victoria had spent years negotiating with founders, inventors, and executives. Most people rushed to sell their ideas. Ethan showed no interest in convincing anyone. Nearby, an engineer named Richard Lawson suddenly stood upright from his inspection. His expression had completely changed. "That cannot be right," he said quietly. Another engineer looked over. "What?" Richard pointed toward a specific section of the design. "If this calculation is accurate, the efficiency numbers make no sense." Several people immediately moved closer. Victoria noticed Ethan remain perfectly calm. No smile. No reaction. Just patience. Richard ran the numbers again. Then checked a different section. His confusion only deepened. "No," he looked directly at Ethan. "Who helped you design this?" "Nobody." "A university?" "No." "A research team?" Ethan shook his head. "Just me." Silence spread through the group. Victoria folded her arms. For the first time all day, she found herself studying Ethan instead of the engine. The quiet mechanic standing in front of her no longer seemed like an amateur inventor. He seemed like someone who already knew exactly where this conversation would end. Ethan's phone vibrated. Lily again. "How many experts are around it now?" A small smile appeared on his face. "Quite a few." Her reply arrived immediately. "Good. They are catching up." Ethan laughed softly. Several nearby engineers looked at him. Their confusion seemed to grow every minute. Then Harold Whittaker slowly stepped away from the engine and pulled out his phone. Victoria noticed immediately. Harold rarely called people during conferences. Yet he dialed a number without hesitation. "I need you down here," he said. "Right now." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Who did you call?" Harold looked at the engine one more time. Then at Ethan. "Someone who needs to see this before the rest of the industry does." For the first time since arriving at the summit, Victoria felt something she had not expected to feel. Not confidence. Not skepticism. Concern. Because whatever those engineers were discovering inside Ethan Carter's hand-built engine, it was important enough to make some of the smartest people in the room nervous. The atmosphere around Ethan Carter's display changed completely over the next 30 minutes. Earlier, people had stopped because they were curious. Now they were staying because they were concerned. More engineers arrived. More specialists appeared. Several carried tablets. Others brought notebooks. One man arrived directly from a private investor meeting and walked straight toward the engine without speaking to anyone. Victoria Hayes watched the growing crowd with increasing unease. She had spent years attending technology conferences. She understood how experts reacted when they discovered something important. This was not excitement. It was tension. The kind of tension that appeared when assumptions started collapsing. Ethan remained exactly the same. Calm. Quiet. Focused. He stood beside the display answering only the questions he considered necessary. Nothing more. Harold Whitaker eventually returned with another visitor. The moment several engineers saw the newcomer, conversations immediately stopped. The man was Samuel Graves, one of the most respected independent powertrain consultants in the country. Companies paid enormous sums for his evaluations. Samuel rarely attended public exhibitions. Yet there he was. He approached Ethan's display without greeting anyone. His attention never left the engine. For nearly 5 full minutes, he said nothing. The crowd waited. Engineers exchanged nervous looks. Victoria folded her arms. Ethan simply watched. Finally Samuel pointed toward a specific section of the design. "Who taught you this?" Ethan looked at him. "Nobody." Samuel nodded slowly. Then he pointed somewhere else. "And this?" Same answer. The consultant leaned closer. The room became quieter. "That is not possible." Ethan smiled faintly. "It seems to be." Several people laughed nervously, but Samuel did not. He continued examining the engine. Then he stepped back. The expression on his face unsettled everyone. Victoria had seen it before. It was the expression experts wore when they encountered something they could not immediately explain. Samuel looked directly at Harold. "Have you verified these numbers?" Harold nodded. "Twice." Samuel stared at the engine again. "Verify them a third time." The request spread through the crowd almost immediately. People began whispering. Reporters moved closer. Cameras turned toward the display. Ethan's phone vibrated. Lily again. "Did anything interesting happen?" Ethan smiled. "A little." "That means yes." He laughed softly. "Maybe." Across the exhibition floor, several investors had noticed the unusual activity and started approaching. They were not engineers. They did not understand the technical discussions. What they understood was behavior. And experienced investors paid attention when experts suddenly became nervous. Victoria noticed the same thing. She stepped closer to Ethan. "Mr. Carter." "Yes, ma'am." "You knew this would happen." Ethan glanced toward the crowd. "Not exactly. But you expected interest." Ethan considered the question. "I expected questions." Victoria studied him carefully. The answer felt honest. That made it even more frustrating. Before she could continue, a voice suddenly called out from the back of the group. "The revised simulation is finished." Every conversation stopped. Engineers turned immediately toward the screen being rolled into position. Samuel Graves looked at the display. Harold looked at the display. Victoria looked at the display. Ethan remained calm. Then the results appeared. Silence spread across the exhibition hall. Not confusion. Not skepticism. Silence. Because for the first time that day, the numbers suggested that Ethan Carter's hand-built engine might not simply be impressive. It might be worth far more than anyone in the building had imagined. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the simulation results appeared on the screen. The silence itself felt unusual. Engineers were not people who stayed quiet when they disagreed. Yet dozens of them stood motionless, staring at the numbers. Samuel Graves looked at the display. Then at the engine. Then back at the display again. Harold Whittaker slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Victoria Hayes felt a strange sensation settle over the crowd. It was not excitement. It was disbelief. The revised calculations showed efficiency gains that should not have existed within a design that simple. More importantly, they suggested possibilities far beyond a single engine. Several engineers immediately requested access to the underlying assumptions. Others began checking the model for errors. Ethan Carter remained beside his toolbox, calm as ever. He seemed completely detached from the growing storm surrounding him. One engineer finally broke the silence. "Run it again." The simulation team nodded. Minutes later, the results appeared once more. They were nearly identical. This time the crowd reacted differently. Conversations erupted throughout the exhibition hall. People moved closer. Reporters abandoned other exhibits and rushed toward Ethan's display. Investors started making phone calls. Victoria noticed the sudden shift immediately. Earlier, the engineers had been asking technical questions. Now the investors were arriving. That changed everything. A tall man in an expensive suit approached Harold Whittaker. "Is it real?" Harold looked at the screen. "I think so." The investor frowned. "Think?" Harold's expression remained serious. Nobody wants to be the first person to say yes. Another investor arrived moments later. Then another. The crowd around Ethan doubled in size. Samuel Graves finally stepped toward Ethan. "How many prototypes have you built?" Ethan thought for a moment. 3. Samuel blinked. "Only 3? The first 2 failed." Several engineers exchanged looks. The answer seemed to surprise them. Ethan had just admitted failure without hesitation. Samuel studied him carefully. "And this?" 1. Ethan glanced toward the engine. "This one taught me something." That answer lingered in the air. Victoria found herself watching Ethan more than the display now. The man standing beside the engine seemed entirely different from the inventor she thought she had judged earlier that morning. He did not act like someone chasing attention. He acted like someone who had spent years solving a problem regardless of whether anyone noticed. Ethan's phone vibrated. "Lily. Are you famous yet?" He smiled. "No," her answer appeared instantly. "Good." He laughed quietly. "Why?" "Because famous people miss school performances." Ethan looked at the message longer than before. "I will not miss yours." "Promise?" "Promise." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Nearby, a group of investors had started their own conversation. Victoria overheard fragments. Licensing rights. Manufacturing partnerships. Acquisition possibilities. The language was changing. People were no longer discussing an interesting invention. They were discussing ownership. Samuel noticed it too. He turned toward Victoria. "You understand what happens if these numbers hold?" Victoria nodded slowly. She understood perfectly. Entire industries had been reshaped by technologies far less impressive than what she was beginning to suspect stood in front of her. Across the hall, additional executives were already arriving after receiving phone calls from colleagues. The summit continued around them, but it no longer felt like the center of attention. Every meaningful conversation now seemed to lead back to one place: Ethan's display. And as more influential people gathered around the hand-built engine, a realization quietly spread through the room. The question was no longer whether Ethan Carter had created something valuable. The question had become how much value the rest of the world was about to discover. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside the summit had become almost unrecognizable. The exhibition floor still contained hundreds of displays, yet the flow of people kept moving toward the same destination. Ethan Carter's engine. What had started as curiosity had evolved into something far more serious. Security staff quietly expanded the area around the display to manage the growing crowd. Reporters requested interviews. Engineers requested technical reviews. Investors requested private conversations. Ethan politely declined most of them. He remained beside the engine, answering only essential questions. The restraint fascinated people almost as much as the machine itself. Victoria Hayes watched the situation unfold from only a few feet away. Throughout her career, she had seen entrepreneurs become overwhelmed by attention. Many started talking too much the moment they sensed opportunity. Ethan seemed immune to it. If anything, the increasing attention made him even quieter. Samuel Graves spent nearly an hour reviewing independent verification reports. When he finally finished, he approached Victoria. The numbers continue holding. Victoria nodded slowly. No major errors? Samuel shook his head. None that anyone has found. Nearby, another engineering team completed its own analysis. Their conclusion matched the previous reports. Then a third group reached the same result. Every new review strengthened confidence. Every new review attracted additional investors. The discussions had moved beyond technical merit. Executives were now calculating market impact. One investor estimated potential licensing revenue. Another discussed manufacturing applications. A third suggested entirely new performance categories that could emerge from the design. Victoria listened carefully. The projections grew larger with every conversation. Yet Ethan appeared completely detached from the financial speculation surrounding him. His phone vibrated again. Lily. Did you eat lunch? Ethan smiled. Of all the questions arriving that day, somehow that one felt the most important. Not yet. Her answer arrived immediately. You always forget. Ethan laughed softly. I know. Do not miss dinner too. I will not. He slipped the phone away and glanced at the time. Several more hours remained before her school performance. Plenty of time. Across the hall, a small group of executives had gathered around Samuel Graves. Their expressions were serious. Victoria eventually joined them. One executive lowered his voice. If the design scales properly, everyone is going to want access. Another nodded. Which means somebody will move first. The statement lingered in the air. Victoria immediately understood what he meant. The technology community followed predictable patterns. Once enough experts agreed that something was valuable, competition arrived quickly. And competition rarely stayed polite for long. Samuel folded his arms. The interesting part is not the efficiency. Several executives looked at him. Then what is? Samuel glanced toward Ethan's display. The simplicity. Silence followed. Everyone understood the implication. Revolutionary technology was valuable. Revolutionary technology that could be reproduced efficiently was something else entirely. Victoria looked toward Ethan. For the first time all day, she felt genuine admiration replacing skepticism. Earlier she had seen a mechanic with an unusual engine. Now she was looking at a man who had quietly solved problems that entire organizations had overlooked. Nearby, another investor arrived. Then another. Phone calls continued. Meetings were being arranged. Assistants moved rapidly across the floor. The pressure inside the building kept growing. Yet Ethan remained exactly where he had been all day. Beside his toolbox. Beside his engine. Calm. Patient. Unmoved by the attention. Because while everyone else was beginning to think about ownership, contracts, and future profits, Ethan Carter was thinking about something entirely different. He was thinking about keeping a promise to his daughter before the day was over. The first formal offer arrived just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It happened quietly. No stage. No announcement. One investor simply approached Ethan Carter with a business card and a number written on the back. Ethan glanced at it for less than a second before handing it back. "Thank you," he said politely. "I am still listening." The investor nodded and walked away. Unfortunately for him, several other executives had seen the exchange. Within minutes, speculation spread across the exhibition floor. People wanted to know the number. Nobody knew. That uncertainty only made the atmosphere more intense. Victoria Hayes watched the reaction carefully. The conversations had changed again. Earlier, engineers dominated the discussion. Now investors were driving everything. Groups gathered in corners. Phones remained pressed against ears. Assistants rushed between meetings. Something larger was forming. Samuel Graves noticed it too. "It has started," he said quietly. Victoria looked toward him. "What has?" Samuel glanced around the crowded hall. "Competition." Another executive approached Ethan. Then another. Some requested private meetings. Others offered introductions to investment groups. Ethan treated every conversation exactly the same way. Calm. Respectful. Brief. He never appeared impressed by titles or company names. That alone seemed to unsettle people. One executive finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "Mr. Carter, do you realize what this could be worth?" Ethan looked at the engine. "I know what it cost me." The executive smiled. "That is not what I mean." Ethan nodded politely but offered nothing more. The answer traveled through the crowd within minutes. By now reporters were following nearly every movement around the display. Cameras pointed toward the engine. Interviews were being recorded. Industry websites began publishing updates from the summit. More visitors arrived after reading the news. Victoria found herself standing beside Ethan again. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally she broke the silence. "You seem remarkably calm." Ethan looked toward the growing crowd. "Should I not be?" Victoria smiled slightly. "Most people would be overwhelmed." Ethan considered that. Most people probably spent less time building it. For the first time all day, Victoria laughed. Not at him. With genuine appreciation. Then she became serious again. "I owe you an apology." Ethan looked at her. "For what?" "This morning." Ethan glanced toward the engine. "That feels like a long time ago." Victoria studied him carefully. He was not dismissing her apology. He genuinely seemed uninterested in holding resentment. That realization affected her more than she expected. Nearby, another investor arrived. With a legal team. Then another executive joined the conversation. Numbers were being discussed now. Large numbers. Some estimates drifted into the tens of millions. Every new figure attracted more attention. Samuel Graves eventually approached with fresh analysis reports. The latest verification confirms everything. Several investors immediately requested copies. The pressure inside the hall continued rising. Yet Ethan's phone vibrated once again. "Lily. Do not forget." Ethan smiled before opening the message completely. "The performance starts at 7. He checked the time. Less than 3 hours remained. Around him, executives discussed contracts that could change industries. Reporters chased headlines. Investors chased opportunities. But Ethan focused on a single sentence. The performance starts at 7. As the crowd continued growing and new offers began appearing from every direction, one thing became increasingly clear. The bidding had not truly started yet. But everyone in the building could feel it coming. And when it arrived, it was going to be much bigger than anyone expected. The first public number appeared just after 5 o'clock. Nobody planned it. Nobody organized it. It simply happened. An executive representing a performance technology group stepped forward and asked Ethan Carter for a private discussion. Ethan listened politely. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, the executive extended a business card. $10 million. The words were spoken quietly. Unfortunately, dozens of people were standing close enough to hear them. The effect was immediate. Conversations stopped. Several investors turned around. Reporters moved closer. For a brief moment, the entire area became silent. Ethan looked at the card. Then at the executive. "That is generous," he said. "But I am not making any decisions today." The executive nodded respectfully. Yet the damage was already done. The number spread through the exhibition hall faster than any official announcement could have. $10 million. Within minutes, everyone knew. Investors who had been observing from a distance suddenly became active. Executives began making phone calls. Assistants hurried through crowded walkways carrying tablets and legal documents. Victoria Hayes watched the transformation unfold in disbelief. Earlier that morning, people had laughed at the engine. Now experienced investors were competing for the opportunity to discuss it. Samuel Graves stood beside her. "This is moving faster than I expected." Victoria nodded. "How much higher can it go?" Samuel glanced toward the growing crowd. "You are asking the wrong question." Victoria looked at him. "What is the right question?" Samuel folded his arms. "How many companies have realized what they are looking at?" The answer arrived almost immediately. Another executive approached Ethan. This one represented an international automotive group. The conversation lasted even less time. $12 million. Several nearby investors exchanged uneasy looks. Then another offer appeared. $15 million. The crowd grew larger. Reporters began broadcasting live updates. Engineers who normally avoided financial discussions now stood quietly watching events unfold. Ethan remained exactly the same. Calm. Patient. Unimpressed. His phone vibrated. "Lily. How is your day?" Ethan smiled. Around him, millions of dollars were changing direction. Yet that simple question somehow felt more important than all of it. "Busy." Her answer appeared seconds later. "Mine too." Ethan laughed softly. "I will be there." "I know." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Nearby, another executive raised an offer. Then another followed. $20 million. $25 million. The atmosphere became surreal. Nobody had expected a bidding contest to emerge in the middle of an engineering summit. Yet that was exactly what was happening. Victoria found herself remembering her own words from that morning. "I suppose confidence is free." The memory made her uncomfortable. Because confidence had never been the story. Competence had. And she had completely missed it. Across the hall, investors who arrived late struggled to understand what was happening. They saw only the result. Crowds. Cameras. Executives competing. They had no idea the entire chain of events began with a quiet mechanic unloading a hand-built engine from an old pickup truck. Another offer surfaced. $30 million. Audible reaction spread through the crowd. Several reporters exchanged stunned looks. Samuel Graves shook his head slowly. "This is no longer about an engine. Victoria looked toward Ethan. Then what is it about? Samuel's answer came immediately. Ownership of the future. Around them, phones continued ringing. Executives continued negotiating. New offers continued arriving. And with every passing minute, one reality became impossible to ignore. The bidding war everyone feared was no longer approaching. It had already begun. By 6 o'clock, the number had crossed $50 million. Nobody in the exhibition hall could quite believe it. What began as a quiet display in the independent exhibitor section had become the center of the entire summit. Executives stood shoulder to shoulder with investors. Reporters broadcast live updates. Industry analysts scrambled to revise projections. The bidding had become a story of its own. Every new offer seemed to erase the one before it. Yet through all of it, Ethan Carter remained remarkably unchanged. He listened. He thanked people for their interest. He answered questions when necessary. Then he returned to checking the time. Victoria Hayes noticed it before anyone else. While investors discussed ownership percentages and licensing structures, Ethan kept looking at his phone. Eventually she approached him. "You are leaving soon." Ethan glanced at the screen. "I am." Victoria looked around at the crowded hall. "You realize there are people here willing to spend tens of millions of dollars to speak with you?" Ethan nodded. "I know. And you are still leaving." A faint smile appeared on his face. "I promised my daughter." For a moment, Victoria said nothing. The noise of the summit continued around them. Reporters rushed past. Investors negotiated. Assistants carried documents between meeting rooms. Yet somehow the simple answer felt more important than all of it. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "Mr. Carter." Ethan turned toward her. "Yes?" She hesitated for only a second. "I was wrong this morning." Ethan said nothing. "I judged you before I understood what I was looking at." The crowd continued moving around them. Neither seemed to notice. Victoria extended her hand. "I am sorry." Ethan looked at her hand, then shook it. "Thank you." No speech. No lecture. No victory lap. Just 2 words. Somehow that made the moment feel even more sincere. Nearby, Samuel Graves watched the exchange and smiled quietly. He had spent decades studying engineers and inventors. The most talented ones often shared the same trait. They cared more about the work than the recognition. Ethan checked the time once more. Then he closed his toolbox. The simple action immediately drew attention. Several investors noticed. "Where is he going?" someone asked. Another executive looked confused. "The bidding is still happening." Yet Ethan began packing the display. Calmly. Methodically. Exactly the way he had unpacked it that morning. His phone vibrated. "Lily. Are you coming?" Ethan smiled. "Already on my way." A few minutes later, he rolled the engine toward the exit. People stepped aside as he passed. Not because they were asked to. Because they wanted to. Conversations grew quieter. Reporters lowered microphones. Executives stopped talking. The same crowd that had laughed at the sight of the engine that morning now watched in complete silence. Victoria stood near the center of the hall as Ethan moved toward the doors. Beyond him, investors continued raising offers. $50 million had already been exceeded. More proposals were still arriving. Yet Ethan never looked back. Outside, the evening sun painted the Texas sky with shades of gold. Ethan loaded the engine into his old pickup truck, climbed behind the wheel, and started the engine. Across town, a young girl waited backstage inside a school auditorium. She was not thinking about investors. She was not thinking about technology. She was thinking about whether her father would keep his promise. Ethan smiled as he pulled onto the road. Behind him, millions of dollars continued changing hands. Ahead of him was the only audience that truly mattered.